When it comes to horror movie monsters, there are plenty of heavy hitters, from the slashers of the 80s to the many different giant monsters to the strange critters that keep on coming. There is so much to discuss. However, a lot of should-be classics just don't seem to be front of mind, and that is a tragedy. So today we're gonna bring up some less loved but totally worthy monsters that deserve more attention. It's time for the top 5 horror movie monsters nobody talks about. Coming in at number 5, we've got Grabbers from Grabbers. There is an absolute wealth of funny, self-aware, and super creative horror out there, and a lot of it does go under the radar. Like, it'll win an award at a smaller film fest and get featured at a popular midnight screening and then spend its days wasting away on a non-premiere streaming service. Or maybe it doesn't even make it onto a streaming service and folks have to scrounge for the DVDs. Stuff like Wolf Cop, Black Sheep, and the Banana Splits movie. Maybe it's just me, but I think movies like these deserve to be in the modern movie lexicon way more often than they are. Give it 20 years or so and we'll see how the filmgoers of the future like them. Grabbers is one of these movies. Immaculately shot with a phenomenal cast, but it's low budget and it comes from a not so premier movie making market, so it gets lost in the shuffle. They could make a whole cheesy series based on these monsters, hitting up different seaside towns with different drinking cultures, but I doubt it'll ever happen. The Grabbers themselves are incredible though. Horrific little tentacle things with blood-sucking leechy mouths and a penchant for seeking out people wherever they may be. It's just an excellent utilitarian monster design, and they can do so much too. Give them a rainy town and you'll watch the chaos ensue. The little ones can shuffle around, finding different sources of blood even if they're hiding away. Plus, they don't quite die when they dry up, they just wait for another chance to moisten up and attack people. Then there's the big ones. They roll around looking for fresh blood, and if they can come across a liquored up individual, they can still dispatch them with a swift flick of the tentacle. Seriously, how can such a fun and freaky monster not be at the forefront of all sorts of horror conversations, especially when the best way to combat them is to get super drunk? It's a mystery for sure, but with plenty of people turning to getting sozzled as a coping mechanism during lockdowns, we can be sure that we're safe from these freaks. But again, I implore producers and other well-moneyed folks out there to make another Grabbers. Send the creatures to a new locale and let's see some more drinks go down. It'll be fun, I promise. And you know what? If it doesn't sound like a good idea right now, it will after a couple beverages. Give it a shot. Coming in at number 4, we've got The Stuff. When it comes to world-consuming goop, most folks are more familiar with The Blob. There's the iconic 1958 version featuring a young Steve McQueen and a bangin' theme song, and then there's the 80s version which is strange and beautiful in all of its own ways. But there's another deadly goo out there that outweirds both blobs, and it often goes undiscussed. Yeah, we're talking about The Stuff. You just can't get enough. How does it work? Why does it grow under the earth? Why has nobody found it before now? Who cares? It looks like marshmallow fluff, tastes incredible, and takes America by storm through some clever marketing and low-calorie brainwashing. In addition to being a deadly monster, it's also a metaphor for the dangers of modern Western consumerism and the carelessness of the folks up top. What more could you ask for? Well, a whole lot more apparently, because not only do we get a wild ride and a less than hidden message, but we also get some jaw-droppingly strange performances, a bunch of near nonsensical one-liners, and a big pile of hilarious practical effects. Want to see some white foam crawl up the walls in a room and then get burned to a crisp? Or maybe you'd like to see a whole militia get subsumed by a torrent of fluff. Better yet, let's watch a man named Chocolate Chip Charlie, famed for his martial arts expertise and snack food excellence, get melted from the inside out while he spews foam from a too wide mouth. It's just the stuff of legends, and it's a shame that so many people only know this movie as a goofy blob ripoff. It is so much more than that, even if it is extremely silly. More movies like The Stuff need to be made, and for that to happen, more folks need to be talking about The Stuff. When you come up with a monster that is both edible and somehow manages to consume the people eating it, you know you've got a gem. It's fascinating and funny, and it doesn't take itself too seriously. Internal logic, we don't need that where we're going, so grab your spoons and your shaving cream. It's time to find the stuff. Coming in at number 3, we've got Pumpkinhead. If you were to survey all sorts of folks about what horror villains they remembered, you'd probably get a lot of the big boys. You know, Freddy, Jason, Michael Myers, Chucky, Pennywise, maybe Ghostface. All well-deserved for sure, but there's a few movie monsters that manage to slip through the cracks of our collective subconscious, and they don't get the universal acclaim and recognition that they deserve. Pumpkinhead is one such monster. He's got everything going for him: a wicked design, an action-packed first outing, a classic revenge-fueled backstory, and more. So why doesn't Pumpkinhead get talked about in the same breath as many of the other fiends I mentioned earlier? And that is a pretty good question. Maybe the story of the first movie is just too tragic, or maybe the revenge that Ed Harley enacts is just too brutal. It could be that Pumpkinhead came along too late in the 80s and wasn't fresh enough to leave that same lasting impression on the public at large. But looking back on the wicked kills and disturbing implications of its existence, we can see that Pumpkinhead can swing with the best of them. Just look at them. There are sequels, but none of them got a theatrical release. It's a known phenomenon that sequels usually tend to be less good than the original, but most horror franchises get a couple theatrical outings before going to home video. Ah well, at least Terror Dome acknowledges Pumpkinhead's place among the best of the horror icons. Coming in at number 2, we've got Kothoga. The Relic might not be the world's best horror movie, but it introduced the world to the Kothoga, and that's more than enough for me. Also known as He Who Walks on All Fours, it's somewhat based on the Skinwalkers of Navajo lore. An absolute chimera of a monster, there's a smorgasbord of DNA floating around inside this horrid creature. You've got the speed of a greyhound, the intelligence of a man, and the adaptability of a gecko. It stinks, and it loves to kill people. And of course, it looks like a nightmare wrapped up in slime and scales. Goodness gracious. When so much goes into the creation of a monster, you really do have to give it props for even existing at all. It is too bad that the movie was underwhelming, because a monster like this deserves plenty of time in the spotlight, although it definitely manages to be stealthier in the dark. Originally an anthropologist named John Whitney, the excess consumption of some mysterious mushroom soup causes a hormonal imbalance and begins to enact mutations. Before his mutation fully completes, he manages to sneak aboard a ship and makes it back to Chicago. It's here that Kothoga truly becomes a monster, stalking the tunnels beneath the Museum of Natural History and eating people's brains. Totally radical. Kinda makes me want to be an anthropologist. And last up at number 1, we've got the vines. Now here is a controversial take. Of all the monsters on this list, the number 1 pick for this list is a bunch of deadly plants. That's right, we're not talking about the Triffids either, or whatever the hell was going on in the Happening. It's time to talk about those vines from the Ruins. Based on the book of the same name, the Ruins is a truly terrifying ride through a plant-filled nightmare. Getting tangled in vines is one thing, and any plants with defense mechanisms like thorns or poison can be pretty scary too. But these particular climbing plants are malicious and malevolent. They can think, they can trick people, they can imitate voices and other sounds. Imagine for a moment getting outsmarted by a plant. And then the plant tortures you, eats your friends, and continues to psychologically torment any survivors. These things are so horrible, the locals literally enforce deadly quarantine on anyone who stumbles across the hill on which they grow. So if you haven't seen The Ruins, I'd advise going and doing that now, and maybe read the book too. Coming in at number 5, we've got the Infection from Splinter. Dangerous, deadly, and dang cool, this assimilated mass of splinters and organic materials is a monster that should be talked about way more. Director Toby Wilkins stretched his budget, creativity, and other resources to the max to make this creature work. So many iterations of it in pre-production, so much work with a local gymnast to make the motions appear both unnatural and totally right for what it was. Hell, the fact that they worked so hard to make the creature look the way it does without using a lot of digital effects is incredible. And I'm just talking about behind the scenes so far too. The actual monster looks great throughout the movie and is a genuinely scary force to be reckoned with. In Splinter, 2 very different couples end up in the same car on the way to a gas station in the middle of nowhere. The folks who own the car are a law-abiding duo who wanted to have a nice camping vacation, while the newest passengers are trying to make their way to the border without raising any suspicions. Not the friendliest conversations going on for sure. But when they arrive at the gas station to quickly refuel and find some snacks, they realize something is very wrong. The attendant is in the bathroom and very infected with some sort of splintery muck. These splinters take over any organism they come in contact with, transforming the host into an animalistic mass of flesh and spikes, looking to kill and subsume anything and everything with a pulse. The way it moves around, shambling unsettlingly quickly, is fascinating, and it finds all sorts of ways to kill and absorb its prey. Severed parts can act on their own to kill people, and often when they find new bodies, they will fuse together, creating bigger, more disgusting flesh amalgamations. Eventually, the surviving trio, sorry Lacey, realize that the infection is a zombifying fungus that uses its infected hosts to seek out more prey. It hunts by sensing warmth, which is bad news for humans everywhere. It takes a lot of guts and hard work to make a creature feature like this work, but the fungal infection in Splinter has so much going for it, and on such a small budget too, so it deserves all sorts of high praise. For whatever reason, it seems as though this one has been relegated to the relative underground, but I'm sure in due time, through the power of the internet, more folks will get to see and appreciate the monstrous excellence. Coming in at number 4, we've got the slugs from Slither. And speaking of well thought out monsters with less success than they deserve, here's a bunch of space slugs that Dunwich horror a sleepy town, directed by a young James Gunn. If that's not a recipe for success, I don't know what is. In Slither, a weird, rocky space egg touches down in the woods outside a small town. The local moneybags and his adulterous companion drunkenly prance their way into the trees and come across it just in time to be attacked by the slimy slugs within. This sets off a crazy series of events culminating in an entire mansion filled with flesh. You didn't see that one coming. See, these slugs are more than just slippery little monsters. At first, it might seem like they're similar to the titular creeps from Night of the Creeps, but as they germinate and grow, they become so much more. See, when they enter Grant, what a name by the way, he begins to act a little weird. He's more enigmatic than ever and begins to slowly transform into a strange, tentacly monster. As this happens, the slugs also influence Grant to infect his side chick Brenda and stow her away in a barn. So we've got the slowly transforming Grant on one hand, who is more dangerous with each passing moment, and then there's Brenda, who is inflating to enormous proportions full of slugs. Then, when the time is just right, she explodes like an overfilled water balloon, sending thousands of space slugs careening through the surrounding area. It is hideous, horrifying, and a little hilarious. And that's just the beginning. The amount of different ways these slugs are used throughout the movie is incredible, ranging from classic Wes Craven bathtub homage to a man being sliced in half by a tentacle whip in an open field to the enormous house full of pulsing flesh that I may have mentioned earlier. This is a movie that exudes personality, and a lot of horror movies that release around the same time can't necessarily say the same. The slugs start small but finish strong, and that's all you can ask for, really. But again, James Gunn was behind all this, so of course it ranks highly. Coming in at number 3, we've got the Djinn from Wishmaster. Be careful what you wish for, right? I'm actually surprised more people haven't tried to make movies about wishes gone sour. It's just such rich ground for excellent misinterpretation. I guess there was Wish Upon a few years ago, but that's a hot mess and a whole other category. But yeah, after 4 installments in the Wishmaster series, you'd think more folks would be scrambling to revive the series or at least do something with the IP. Especially with the OG Wishmaster being produced by Wes Craven and starring Angus Scrimm as the narrator. That's horror gold right there. Back to the monster itself, the Djinn is an evil genie who grants wishes in exchange for souls, but will always turn the wish into a curse. Kind of like a monkey's paw situation, you know? Wish for something you want, end up getting it, but it's been made into something nobody would ever want. I wish I didn't have to feel this pain right now. Well, then you'll die. I wish you would stop nagging me. And the person nagging you gets in an accident and loses their ability to speak. I wish I had more money. You get the money through some weird legal technicality after the local orphanage burns down. There's so much to do with people's desires using this character, plenty of irony to funnel into fun moments, and unlike a lot of other horror icons from that era of horror movie making, it seems as though the Djinn is not front of mind. Maybe the screenwriters wished for success, but then are doomed to spend eternity being forgotten. Who knows? Coming in at number 2, we've got the Jotun from The Ritual. Bar none, this is one of the coolest looking monsters out there. Like, the whole movie is basically a setup for the crazy reveal at the end, and it is totally worth it. You get little glimpses at this thing moving around in the distance, and a whole lot of time is spent making folks wonder if it's real or if they're just imagining things. Elaborate kills are put together to ensure that everyone knows just how big and powerful and full of malice this monster is, and it really sets the stage for when it finally appears. And once it does appear, it is lights out. The enormous reindeer-like chimera is a sight to behold, and it's not just about the looks either. The implication that it has held people in this little village with the promise of immortality only to let them waste away into barely living mummified bodies is horrifying. The guilt that it embodies, forcing people to relive terrible moments before luring them to their doom, is incredible. And it kills people by lifting them up, making them look into its dark eyes, and then impaling them on sharp trees. That's hardcore. Worship it and live a life of solitude and ritual, or be sacrificed. A tough choice with no real good answer. After releasing on Netflix a few years ago, The Ritual has kind of disappeared from the forefront of horror conversations, but I'd say this monster is an all-timer. Let's bring it back. And finally at number 1, we've got the graboids, ass blasters, and more from Tremors. Come on, how are we gonna talk about underrated monsters and not bring up the legendary subterranean worms from Tremors? They've shouldered the weight of an entire franchise and still managed to go underappreciated. These things are legendary. From the first movie starring Kevin Bacon all the way up to the latest installment that was released in 2020, they've been burrowing underground and causing all sorts of problems for folks for years. Graboids don't mess around. 50-foot, leathery, hungry worms that burrow underground and emerge to swallow stuff whole. You can see the Dune influence for sure, but Tremors and all the subsequent entries make these creatures something else entirely. There are the classic graboids, which function largely underground, and that's just the beginning. They can spawn shriekers, which then run around above ground, and then there's blasters, which can fly and sense heat. It's a miracle anyone survived an encounter with these things. But for whatever reason, Tremors has been relegated to the B tier of horror, beloved but less well known. So if you're a fan of Tremors, sound off in the comments and let all the other folks find you. Coming in at number 5, we've got the monster from The Host. Way back before Bong Joon-ho thrilled audiences all the way to an Oscar win, he was still making wicked movies. Memories of Murder, Mother, and of course the environmentally minded political monster movie The Host. Somebody recommended I give this a watch while I was in university, and late one night I decided to put on. Excellent choice. Man, even if you want to look past all the powerful messages expertly threaded throughout the movie, the monster scenes alone make it worth watching. They're that good. The very first scene we see the monster in is so chaotic, so wonderfully shot, so expert in its use of its horrific creature that it hooks you for the rest of the flick. From then on, it doesn't matter what happens as long as there's the potential for more monster action just like that. It's just such a cool creature. The enormous body and eyes of a fish, so cold and inhuman. The crazy sweeping lizard tail that can be used as a prehensile limb for climbing, as well as a weapon for absolutely tossing victims. It can swim through the nasty water from which it originated, making it extremely difficult to track down. But it can also move at high speeds on land, making it a dangerous predator to humans. Plus, its legs are just super freaky to look at. Worst of all is that mouth. Just look at it. The folds, the flaps, the teeth. That is one hole you do not want to find yourself looking down. On top of all the terrifying physical attributes that make up the Host's monster, there's also the fact that it's the host to a deadly virus that nobody seems to have an answer for. In fact, it gets so bad that the government decides that Agent Yellow is a better call than waiting to see what happens. Death by monster and virus, or death by chemicals. Neither a great choice. And of course, the monster itself was implicitly created by human wastefulness. At the beginning of the movie, we watch as 200 bottles of formaldehyde is dumped into the river, eventually killing off all the resident fish and giving rise to this deadly being. The digital effects used to render this creature might be a little dated, but there's no denying the effectiveness of the monster, even more than a decade later. For a monster that will make you equally terrified and thoughtful, check out The Host. Coming in at number 4, we've got Billy from Black Christmas, 1974. We could talk about the updated iterations of Billy and Agnes from different Black Christmases over the years, but nothing tops the mystery and madness of that first killer man-child. The fact that we never actually see Billy really manages to say something about how scary Bob Clark managed to make his movie. Throughout the movie, we're treated to POV shots of this maniacal murderer sneaking into the sorority house and stealthily picking off different unfortunate souls. There's that first bit where he manages to scale the trellis and slink his way into the closet of an unsuspecting Claire Harrison. The resulting plastic bag kill will go down in horror history for sure, and from there, things only get creepier. The profane phone calls keep rolling in, and the police aren't quite able to pin down where they're coming from. Murders and disappearances continue to happen, but nobody's piecing everything together. And the whole time, Billy is gibbering away in the attic, screaming and hissing about some long-lost trauma concerning Agnes. The fact that his motives are so unclear, his history so muddled, adds to the sheer terror he inspires, and the noises this man can make are otherworldly. He can do the world's scariest baby talk, which then morphs into crazy screeches, which might take on guttural aspects or become even more shrill.
Hello? Who is this?
Please stop. Oh, God.
If I answered the phone and heard whatever the hell all that is on the other end, I'd probably just drop dead immediately. I'll take robocalls over that any day. And of course, there's the iconic eyeball through the crack in the door moment. That's the closest we get to actually seeing the villain here, and it is harrowing to say the least. Just a crazed, wide open eye communicating all the killer instinct and bloodlust in the world. Folks talk about Black Christmas being a prototypical slasher and about being Canadian and being ahead of its time, but it's not often enough that Billy gets the same star treatment that Leatherface and Michael Myers get. Put some respect on his name. Coming in at number 3, we've got Xtro from Xtro. Alright, so this might be a bit of a weird call. Xtro as a movie, in my opinion, is not all that scary. In fact, it's pretty darn cheesy, with a whole lot of moments that are more likely to make you snicker than scream. It's the tale of a man abducted by aliens and then brought back and reborn on Earth. There are lots of questionable bits in here, but when Xtro gets scary, it gets really scary. See, at one point, there was one gif ripped from this movie that was scaring folks' pants off with ease. There's a scene near the beginning of the movie where an alien is planted on Earth in some sort of seed, then it pops out and gets hit by a car. This bit with the car rolling down a dark and lonesome road, headlights illuminating this nasty monster, it's incredible. Just watch it. If you saw this out of context, you'd have it burned into your brain for weeks. It's just such a strong and scary image. It's a shame that the rest of the movie can't back it up. Really, this shot from Xtro has more potential to be effectively used in one-off creepypasta than in a cheesy feature-length sci-fi horror. Like, all you need to take away from this movie is this one shot of the monster, and you can call it a win. That is a freaky creature, well placed to become a piece of modern online cryptozoology legend. So yeah, if you've never heard of Xtro, it's probably because it's a pretty mediocre movie. But if you want a freaky monster and a freaky moment, check that bit out. Coming in at number 2, we've got Andrew Tully from Hell House, LLC. And the rest of the Hell House movies. I always find a way to work Hell House into these videos, eh? This is a relatively recent found footage series, well worth a watch if you haven't seen it already, and amazingly enough, they have a whole lot of monsters scattered throughout. The big bad in the first movie probably appeared to be a gray clown, and it was used really effectively for some awesome scares, but as you watch more of the series, you realize that there's one baddie behind it all. Andrew Tully. Briefly mentioned in the first Hell House, Tully's backstory is expanded in the sequels. He was the original owner of the Abaddon Hotel and seemed to perform plenty of unsavory acts within those walls. After being accused of causing the disappearance of a mother-daughter duo, he apparently committed suicide, but even with his body gone, his spirit remained. Over the years, Tully lured countless people into the hotel, toying with them until the perfect moment came along, and then bringing them to the oft-mentioned Lake of Fire. He is a truly malevolent presence, bringing all sorts of fears to life around the haunted hotel. Using his powers to open portals to hell and leading hooded figures on massive massacres, Tully manages to pull the strings behind the scenes like an evil puppet master. Hell House lore is something that not a lot of people seem to know a whole lot about, but there is plenty packed into these found footage fun houses. If you can learn anything from him, it should probably be don't make deals with weird scar-covered men in abandoned hotels, but you probably already knew that. And coming in at number 1, we've got Reeker from Reeker. A supremely underrated slasher from the mid-2000s, Reeker deserves a spot on a whole lot more movie monster lists. This rotten, stinking, drill-wielding monster terrorizes the back roads like no one else, and it is awesome. A bunch of friends decide to head to a rave in the desert, but after a series of bad choices involving stealing drugs from a murderous drug dealer and shacking up at a crappy hotel, they find themselves being hunted down by this decaying demon. The thing is, not everything is as it seems. That's right, there are layers to this modern slasher, and all of the tropes are pretty smartly employed to get the most out of all the scares. Hell, it was good enough to earn a sequel, No Man's Land, The Rise of Reeker. Folks should be looking back on this one with love in their hearts, but it seems that it's been largely forgotten. For shame. Bring back the smelly highway demon. Coming in at number 5, the meteorite aliens from Attack the Block. This whole movie is underappreciated and deserves more love. A bunch of hoodlums in London fighting off aliens in an apartment block using weapons lifted from the local drug dealer? Come on, tell me that doesn't sound like a blast and a half. John Boyega was in this flick pre-Star Wars and Nick Frost was involved as well. Although, the aliens are the true stars of this one. One night, after our main characters mug a nurse, a meteorite touches down atop a poor unfortunate car. The lads find the corpse of the little alien inside and think it's hilarious. Well, they're not laughing for too long as more of these creatures make their way into town. These ones are a whole lot bigger, stronger, and meaner too. Plus, they're able to track down people covered in their pheromones, making them extremely effective hunters. All of the scenes these creatures show up in are super tense, as their presence is always pretty oppressive. They're super violent and super deadly, meaning that one wrong move could result in death. Plus, just look at them. Enormous gorilla-like beasts with Vanta black fur and enormous mouths full of glowing blue teeth. I cannot wrap my head around the fact that this movie is so underappreciated. Like, give these aliens a whole series where they drop down in different areas across the world and have to deal with all the rambunctious youth. There's a whole lot of potential in that idea, so if somebody wants to pay me for it, Just let me know. In the meantime, I'm just gonna go watch the movie again and appreciate the special effects wizardry used in making these creatures come to life. They controlled gigantic puppets in huge suits during the filming of Attack the Block, and then went back to add the extra features like fur that doesn't reflect light, and of course the glowing dental bits. It just makes the beasts feel hyper real and otherworldly at the same time. They carry a lot more weight than a lot of other sci-fi creatures that are strictly digital. These are some seriously fun and freaky movie monsters, although I would never want to run into one in real life. I just don't have enough rough and tumble street urchin pals to back me up if things got scary. Unless. Coming in at number 4, the second baby from It's Alive. I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. Babies are scary. Tiny little parasites that grow inside people until they get too big and have to be painfully forced out, sometimes requiring major surgery in order to preserve the host's life. Then they're miniature humans who don't know how to act, and it's totally up to you to ensure they become decent people who can navigate this hellhole world we inhabit. And they cry and stink and look like this? You don't need a baby to have evil mutant powers to make folks' blood run cold, but when the baby does have a thirst for blood and otherworldly strength, you better watch out. A lot of creature features from the 70s and 80s with less palatable concepts seem to go underappreciated over time, so we'll bring back this one for your viewing pleasure. There's something about the dogged craftsmanship behind flicks like this that make them such a joy to behold, especially when there's a scene of a baby killing a milkman followed by a bunch of bloody milk running at the back of the milk truck like a wild water rapid. The message behind our young lad is a little skewed, especially by today's standards, but it is definitely interesting enough to keep the story going. See, Frank and Leonore wanted to enjoy a little peace and quiet before having a second little crotch goblin in the picture, so Leonore took contraceptive medication. Birth control, but more scarily worded. Eventually, after they had their fun, the couple decided to nix the meds and try for another kid. And it worked, too. Unfortunately, all those years of evil, nasty medication for women, ew, made Leonore's womb a place where devils like to hang out, and the result is a demon baby. Their first kid, Chris, stays at their friend's place while the mom and dad head to the hospital to pop out his sibling, but by the end, he's running for his life. When Leonore makes that final push, the doctors are horrified to discover that her spawn has sharp fingernails, horrible fangs, and a startling amount of bloodlust. It immediately kills all the medical staff in the room and escapes via skylight. Imagine watching a literal newborn do that. It would be hilarious and tragic, but hilarious. Then begins a deadly game of cat and mouse, with the baby both evading capture and dispatching various innocent bystanders throughout town. And this thing is ugly too. Like, whoever designed this baby was absolutely horrified that one day they'd be presented with an unexpected pregnancy. And for a baby, this thing can take a lot of bullets. Like, nobody has any qualms about firing guns at this baby. Some seriously underrated stuff right here. Coming in at number 3, we've got the vodka monster from Leviathan. If you're gonna rip off a movie monster, you might as well make it a good one, right? Well, that seems to be the guiding principle behind the creation of the 1989 underwater monster movie Leviathan. It caught a lot of flack at the time for shamelessly pulling elements from John Carpenter's cult classic The Thing, but in the end, all that means is more fun creature effects for everyone to enjoy. Artistic integrity is a myth. With all that out of the way, let's talk about all the cool stuff this deep sea demon manages to do. So you might have noticed I called this creature the vodka monster. Unfortunately, it doesn't work by the same principle as the cookie monster, but that is a fun thing to imagine anyways. Nope, it actually originated from some tainted vodka, salvaged from a scuttled Russian vessel, Leviathan. Whatever was going on within the titular shipwreck must have been bad, because when the American crew starts partaking in this salvaged spirit, chaos begins to reign. Crew members begin suffering inexplicable wounds, and a couple of corpses end up fusing together to create a disgusting abomination of flesh and bone. The crew decides to dump these bodies into the ocean, but it's too late. A tentacle escapes being ejected and morphs into a hideous creature. Then we reach the Thing-style antics. It can take over bodies, change into different forms, and sneakily kill folks before anyone notices. Plus, there is a wicked final form you do not want to miss. Coming in at number 2, we've got Chud from Chud. Spoiler alert, the acronym for Chud actually has 2 meanings. You've got the classic cannibalistic humanoid underground dwellers, which is just such a great thing for a movie monster to be called, and then there's the second definition, which explains how they came to be. For all you folks out there who haven't managed to witness Chud in all its glory since 1984, I'll spare you the truth. But for most people, Chud is just one big joke. It's cheesy, it's cheap, and the monsters don't exactly look super convincing, but it's fun, alright? And the deadly, nasty humanoids dwelling in the sewers are unforgettable to say the least. They live beneath the city, preying on the homeless folks that have taken shelter in the vast interconnected tunnels. As one might expect, city officials and members of various boards don't really care about the homeless folks down there. They just want the creatures dealt with. And if that means killing every living being underground, so be it. So we've got a double whammy of rubber suit wearing sewer men and political commentary on how the less fortunate are treated. What a movie! What a bunch of monsters. And there's a sequel too. Bud the Chud. And coming in at number 1, we've got The Blob from The Blob, 1988. So you might be thinking to yourself, Keegan, The Blob is a horror icon. Even though it wasn't even well received when it came out, everyone knows The Blob. It even got a theme song. And while all of that may be true, The Blob 1988 is a lot less lauded. The original starred a young Steve McQueen, made use of some hilariously effective blob technology, and set the stage for similar monster movies. But the late 80s remake didn't get the same amount of love and adoration upon release. In fact, a lot of folks discounted it as cheap and poorly made. But the monster itself from this iteration is absolutely incredible. Practical effects were peaking in the late 80s, and a lot of movies were beginning to look to digital effects for the next big thing. So when Chuck Russell decided to stick to a more traditional filmmaking method, he might have raised a few eyebrows. But the effects done up by Tony Gardner and his team were unparalleled. It's so very gooey, so extremely slimy, and just plain cool. That scene where it drops from the ceiling and takes out a Letterman? Next to none. They just don't make monsters like this anymore. Monsters rejoice. You're gonna get a little more attention in the coming days. The more folks watching horror movies, the better, right? So, what'd you think of the list? Did you already know about these movie monsters? What's a horror movie monster you want to get more attention? Make sure you let me know down in the comments. Speaking of comments, let's take a look at some of your more independent ones from the top 5 newest SCP Monsters 2021 Part 3. Rodney Kelly says SCP-5855, that explains VeggieTales. Broccoli, celery, peachy keen, VeggieTales. Barbarian Librarian says, I'm glad somebody finally made a Sailor Moon SCP. It was just waiting to happen. I agree with your comment, but I just have to say you've got a great name. Megiddo Eubanks says, you had me at meat magic. Is that a better line than hello? Sunny Shine says, I use this series and all the other SCP content to pick which one I want to explore next. Good call. While the lists are a great jumping off point, the real good stuff is in the actual entries. And Filthy Sammy says, wish the SCP Foundation was real, frowny face. Well, we can prove they aren't. And that's the time we have for today. I'm going to be especially mean to the large, quiet fellow who works down in the meat processing plant. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.